Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Greg Milner, author of Perfecting Sound Forever, an Aural History of Recorded Music. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Greg Milner has written music and technology journalism for Spin Magazine, Wired, Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, Slate, and Salon. Plus, he's got a brand new, very ambitious book out called Perfecting Sound Forever, an Aural, A-U-R-A-L, History of Recorded Music. Greg, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I love, I just had to mention this absolutely first. I love in your book that you bring up a scene from an issue of Peter Bagg's comic Hate. And Peter Bagg's been on this program. He was a delightful guest. And it's the part that kept coming to my mind before you quoted in the book where the leading slacker, Buddy Bradley, is talking to Phil, who I believe, if I recall correctly, was the gay ex-boyfriend of his girlfriend, also an audiophile. And,
right.
And Buddy's skeptical, and so he asks the guy as a litmus test, do you own a CD player? Phil says, of course not. Those three words always stuck with me, and Buddy says, maybe that guy's all right. Now, that struck me as kind of I was very young when I first read that, so I didn't quite understand the conflict he was trying to suss out there. But let me ask you this. How close were you personally ever to Buddy and Phil's mindset?
At different points in my life, I've been very close to that. I try to temper that now with something more realistic. But there was definitely a point when I was younger where it seemed to me that some sort of badge of, I don't want to say hipness, but sort of a badge of enlightened knowledge when it came to music was someone who was resistant to CDs.
And this is going to open up kind of the can of worms that underlies much of your book, but what technologically underlies that sort of a conflict where it would be the hip thing to like what is less advanced?
Well, I think in terms of CDs, there was just an awareness among a small but sizable amount of people early on that maybe these were not the technological saviors that the industry claimed they were. And so it's this idea that, maybe in some sense they are more technologically advanced, but in other ways they're not. And, we're quote unquote smart enough to understand what those reasons are and hear the difference.
It isn't certainly, from what I can tell by reading your book, an isolated incidence. I mean, you have before that various formats fighting it out. You go back to cylinders versus discs and all that. How many of these battles have there been where there are a couple choices for what format you want to use to record sound, and then people get entrenched?
Yeah, I mean, it goes all the way back, as you say, to cylinders versus discs. Then there's acoustic recording versus electrical recording, 33 1/3 versus 45 RPM, the so-called battle of the speeds, analog versus digital. Yeah, I mean, there always seems to be something.
Did you know then, going into the writing of this book, that this was going to be, in some large part, a history of battles as well as a history of technological developments in labs and in garages and studios and wherever else?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't sure exactly what I'd find, but I figured it was because I feel like when Edison, made the first recording, he opened up a can of worms in a sense because he made this thing that it's essentially an illusion, but dared people to think that of it as the real thing. And so I think that just sets the stage for so many battles, even today, because it all is fake, right? I mean, we're always listening to a representation of something, but it gives people a way to argue about just what it is recordings are supposed to be. And I think in doing so, it opens up larger issues like what do we want art to be? What do we think of authenticity? I think recordings are the perfect arena for those kind of arguments.
Well, let's go back to this since we've brought up Edison, the big bang for sound recording. Now, it sounded to me like it was such an urban legend kind of material that Edison first recorded himself singing Mary Had a Little Lamb, and there it was, the sound recording. Now, that's actually true?
Yeah, that's actually true. 1877, he recorded himself reciting Mary Had a Little Lamb onto tinfoil was the recording medium.
And what's the technology at work here? Because very few people are going to know this as intimately as your research has shown it to you. It's tinfoil as a medium, but what mechanically is going on when this guy's yelling the nursery rhyme into whatever he's yelling it into?
It's a very, very simple process, actually. So simple that it could have been invented hundreds of years before Edison did, and for whatever reason it was not. It's called acoustic recording, and essentially what is happening is this. Something or someone makes a sound that causes a diaphragm to vibrate. The diaphragm is attached to something sharp like a stylus, which then etches a pattern based on those vibrations into a soft recording medium, in the original case, tinfoil. And then to hear it back, it's basically the process is reversed. You spin it back. Those grooves cause the stylus to vibrate in a certain way that causes the diaphragm to vibrate in a certain way, and that recreates the original sound wave. So it's a very, very simple process when you get right down to it.
And in the research process for the book, what did you find that, not necessarily the very first recording ever made, but when you were listening to these Edison cylinders and whatnot, what did you find that they actually sounded like?
I actually had a chance to go back and not go back, but to visit a recording engineer who, believe it or not, his medium is wax cylinders. This is what he makes, and there's a lot of demand for him, actually, more than you might think. He recorded They Might Be Giants on The Daily Show, for example. He's recorded people from the Grammys, but he swears that there's something about Edison cylinders that capture something that just nothing else since then has been able to do. He says that what a lot of people who record with him tell him, especially singers, is that's the way I always thought my voice sounded. And he actually let me make a wax cylinder with him, and I can't rule out the possibility that maybe I was influenced by what he said, but I think I understood. I think I understood. There's something about the wax cylinder that just made me think like, oh, that's me. That's kind of the way I sounded. Like I didn't get that feeling that, I don't know if you get this because you record interviews and hear your voice all the time, but a lot of people, when you hear your voice on like an answering machine, you think, I don't sound like that way, do I? But the wax cylinder actually made me think, God, that sounds kind of like what I think I sound like.
Right. You wouldn't believe how sick I get of my voice editing interviews. It's unbelievable. But yeah. It makes me kind of wish reading the section in the book specifically where you describe going to this guy who makes cylinders and listening to yourself. It actually made me want to hear this. Now, what is the most technologically level-headed explanation for why these things sound so magical to people in 2009?
I thought there was an easy explanation for that, and I was surprised when the engineer's name is Peter Dilge. He can't really explain it either, and there's just something about it. And it really would be hard to explain because by any sort of rational technological way of looking at it, it doesn't record as well, right? There's no way around it. But there's just something about it. But so even a professional like Peter Dilge can't really tell you what it is about them. But Edison was convinced. Edison was so convinced that a cylinder recording could be perfect, and especially an acoustic recording of using a cylinder, that he really felt like he was migrating toward perfection. He resisted electrical recording, which was the next phase of recording, because he really felt like the road to perfection was acoustic recording.
And now you've spoken an extremely dangerous word, perfect. Perfection. How many definitions of perfect sound have you stumbled upon in your research and talking to people in anything, and for your own self? How many ways are there to be perfect with sound recording?
There's an infinite. There are infinite ways to be perfect because there's really no such thing as perfection. If you take even the original meaning of fidelity and the original goal of what recordings were supposed to be, capturing a moment, exactly the way it is, you can never get it exactly right. The magnetic particles on the tape are never going to line up exactly the right way. The grooves of the record aren't going to be exactly right. If you're recording it digitally, you're always making some compromises due to the sampling rate or the bit width or what have you. So really, there's an infinite number of ways to define what perfection is, and it always comes down to people who are assertive enough or come up with a way that makes people think, wow, this is how music is supposed to sound.
There does seem to be this, from what I can tell, is the classic perhaps the eternal, irresolvable divide in audiophilia, or even just listening to music or any form of recorded sound, is this divide between fidelity and presence, between trying to replicate an actual experience of hearing a live produced sound, and between making that and the recording its own experience. Is that a decent way to put it at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the sort of the two ideological poles you find if you look at the history of recording. On the one hand, the idea that a recording is supposed to capture exactly one specific moment and recreate it as closely as possible. I mean, the audiophiles called that presence, the original audiophiles in the 1950s. They wanted to transport the concert hall into the living room, and a lot of them thought you could actually do that. And on the other ideological pole is this idea that a recording has nothing to do with one specific event, that it essentially creates its own reality. And that way of looking at recordings is by far the most dominant way to consider them these days, especially with vis-a-vis commercial recordings. The first way of looking at them is not dead, but it's much less prevalent. But even those two things, I mean, raise all kinds of questions, because taking the first one, for example, what does it even mean to capture something perfectly? So even within those two poles, you have all kinds of gray areas of how you're going to argue for what perfection is, or what reality is, or what a recording is supposed to capture.
It does seem like there is if you want to take an easy route out, you could just say, well, perfect sound is a replication of whatever somebody who was standing right in front of a band or in whatever sweet spot in a physical location was hearing. But then it rules out the whole world of things that are created purely as recorded sound, does it not?
Absolutely. I mean, and the first way was for a long time, I mean, audiophiles really felt that was the way. And by audiophiles, by the way, I mean the original audiophiles of the 1950s, which was the original high-fidelity movement, which was not limited to like a small subsection of nerdy hi-fi people. It was like a real mass-market phenomenon. And it was just accepted that it was supposed to, good sound was only a sound that tried to imitate reality in a way. It was very much of a piece of a lot of other trends happening in the post-war world, where it was this frontier to be conquered, right? And someday we would conquer it. But of course, it's a very, very limiting way to look at music. And as technology developed, it became much more problematic. I mean, looking at the original idea of high fidelity, capturing a moment perfectly, there's virtually no recording today, commercial recording, I mean, with some exceptions. There are very, very few that try to do that. And I know people right now are thinking, well, what about this, this, and this? But I'm talking about the vast majority of commercial recordings.
This sort of ravenous, status-seeking, aspirational 1950s hi-fi set. Now, I may have answered this question in posing it, but what do you think that the pursuit of better and better audio recording replication equipment was to them? I mean, was this just a base human status-seeking sort of thing, or what do you think was going on there?
Well, one clue as to what I think is going on is the curious fact that a lot of these audiophiles didn't even really listen to music much. They tested their hi-fi systems on what were essentially sound effects records. There was a record called Rail Dynamics put up by a man named Emery Cook, who became very famous as one of the more notorious audiophiles. And this was recordings he made of commuter trains in New York, just very, very, very well done. And it became, like a real mass market smash. The reason I bring this up is because I think for people it was a way, it wasn't just about music or perfect sound. It was about trying to orient themselves in the world, trying to think like, if I can transport the concert hall into my living room, I'm living the good life. I'm living the best life possible.
I think my grandfather actually had a few of those, the ping pong ones where the game goes back and forth over the left and right speakers. And I always thought to myself as a kid, what is he doing with these things? I guess that answers my question.
Yeah, especially when stereo became a thing. Yeah, ping pong was a very popular thing, the going back and forth. Ping pong, trains, church bells, these were all greatest hits.
So as this timeline progressed through the mid-20th century, what started putting cracks into the easy idea that, well, the hi-fi system replicates like a real physical condition or place that you would be in?
Well, I think the real big moment is the introduction of magnetic tape, because with magnetic tape, you get a sort of heretofore unrealized sense of flexibility. You can just splice in a moment or splice out a moment. All of a sudden, the idea of a recording as a capturing event really has less and less currency. And then once multi-track recording became more of a reality, it made that even more problematic, because with multi-track recording, there didn't even have to be a performance to start with. You could just build one from the ground up. So I think really, and it's interesting because all of this is happening around the time the 1950s audiophiles are, really really at the peak of their influence in terms of numbers. So while they're all preaching this gospel of high fidelity, there's this new technology that, on one hand, made high fidelity possible because magnetic tape made for much more high fidelity recordings. But on the other hand, it was kind of its death knell, because all of a sudden, what did it even mean you could never be certain if you were listening to a recording, whether it was a recording of a real event or whether it was manipulated in some way.
This is something that I found. I think it was the most fascinating thing I found about your analysis of this history in your book, is that almost every audiophile technological advance put a nail or struck a blow against the ideology of audiophilia. Am I making stuff up there, or is that actually kind of a pattern that has been happening?
No, absolutely. From the mid-20th century on, it's not every technological advance, but most technological advances can be seen in a way as trading a certain notion of traditional fidelity for flexibility. For example, as the number of tracks available to multi-track recording as they increased, the recording consoles went from being powered by vacuum tubes to being powered by transistors, solid state. Because with all those tracks, tubes would get hot. It was just too complicated. But, a lot of engineers will even tell you today that those records made in the 50s and 60s sound better, partly because they were made on these tube consoles. Jeff Emmerich, the Beatles' longtime famous engineer, still to this day talks about how Abbey Road, which was the only one of their records recorded on a transistorized console, he couldn't quite get something that he could get on all those records. There's something kind of missing about it. But again, the records that we've loved for the last 30, 40 years, there's no way they could have been made without all these compromises in fidelity. They just couldn't be done. They all depend on multitrack. So you see that trend replicate all throughout, even up until today with digital recording. For example, what's known as the loudness war means that, in simple terms, the dynamic range of compact discs today, on average, is less than the dynamic range of recordings made in the pre-digital era. And by dynamic range, we mean the difference between the softest sound that's recorded and the loudest sound that's recorded. So you can just keep coming up with all these examples of things where there's been a real trade-off.
Now, I most certainly want to talk about that loudness war, but first, since we brought up the introduction of magnetic tape, now, a 17-year-old listening to this who likes to record himself playing music on his Mac laptop or what have you will think of, magnetic tape is kind of a joke to them generally, unless they're real hipsters and they kind of want to go back to it. But
right.
Since I think a non-audiophile listener won't know this, but we'll be interested, what did that represent, a magnetic tape? What was being used to record before that, and what was wrong with it?
Before that, it was mostly disc recording. You'd record right onto a disc that could be, I think, various materials, such as aluminum. You were recording direct to the disc. What you had there was all you had in the moment. You couldn't really edit the way you could in fact, you couldn't edit at all. It went right onto the disc. They were fragile, too. They didn't last very long. So magnetic tape was this dramatic improvement on all these fronts. It was flexible. It was stronger. The sound was better. The various methods of disc recording, and if you want to go all the way back to Edison, of course, you're recording directly onto wax cylinders, going way back to the beginning. So tape really just exploded things in every which way.
And of course, today, when one thinks of tape, the first thing to come to mind is tape hiss. And to many people, that hiss that goes on when you play a tape of virtually any kind, but especially the consumer cassette tapes you would use in an old car stereo, that almost ruins it for a lot of people. But evidently, I'm assuming, and this has been also a pattern in the history of recorded sound, people saw so much improvement or heard so much improvement, they didn't even kind of know tape hiss was there initially?
Right. And I mean, one of the things that really blew the average consumer away regarding compact discs when they were introduced was this idea that you could go from complete silence and then all of a sudden music is coming out of the speakers. You don't have that noise bed that you have with magnetic tape. Now, there's some evidence to suggest that people who prefer analog sound to digital sound, that hiss it plays some role in it. It kind of Bob Woods, who was one of the people who founded Telarc Records, probably the first record company to put out digital recordings, even before there were compact discs, he calls it feathering the edges with that sort of hiss. And and he's argued with a lot of people who say that analog sounds better. And he said, look, it really, if you like the way it sounds, that's fine, but it does not sound more realistic. And part of the reason is, I mean, there are various reasons, but that hiss is a perfect example of one of the reasons. It kind of gives it a sort of warmth.
So much of the bitterness of these battles of CD versus vinyl in a slightly earlier era, or more broadly, digital versus analog, it seems to be that these battles have sparked over perhaps an issue of semantics. I mean, one person will be saying, this sounds better, when maybe they mean more accurate to the recorded sound. Maybe they mean, I just enjoy it more. I mean, how much of this can we put down to terms not being clarified well enough?
Yeah, in a way, I mean, I guess it's a linguistic problem, right? I mean, it's because, and it goes all the way back to the original notion of what a recording is. I think there's still, even today, a sort of instinct to equate recording, something sounding quote unquote good with something sounding quote unquote realistic. And that's always been the rub, right? Because, I mean, that's not necessarily, those two are not necessarily the same thing.
I do feel like this could be somehow settled, though. I mean, couldn't you have a group who just says, oh, well, we kind of like the sound of vinyl, we like the sound of the crackle, we like the sound of tape hiss, and we're just calling that good. And then, there's the other group that says, well, we want to eliminate all that and just try to get the sound waves. Why can't peace be made? Why can't there be a two-state solution, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I suppose there can. I mean, you can look at it as it depends on the type of music being made. But it really is a fundamental sort of philosophical split, really. And you see that in digital versus analog much more than anything. Thomas Stockham, who was really one of the godfathers of digital audio, who created probably the first digital recorder, he used to talk about how, look, he's like, he had no problem with people saying that they preferred the sound of tape or analog, that they thought it sounded better, but it really got on his nerves when he said that it sounded more more realistic, because he said, look, if the purpose is to recreate something like the original as closely as possible, I can show you right here. Look at these charts. Look at the waveforms. I've done it. But so don't tell me it's more realistic. If you like it better, more power to you. But don't tell me that it's more realistic. So I think it's a sort of a difficult divide to navigate, because it does represent two kind of very different ways of considering what recordings are.
And this brings to mind one of the, I think, more incisive quotes, whether it was meant to be that by the speaker or not. I forget who exactly said it, but when they said that a vinyl album sounds more like a record, I mean, it sounds more accurate to their idea of what listening to a record, the experience is. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that was Doug Sachs who said that, who was one of the original anti-digital gadflies who ran, maybe still runs, I don't know what he does today, but ran a classical music label around that time. And yeah, he said it sounds like a record. Because if you really investigate what digital recording is capable of, it can capture more than analog can, on some level. But there's something about it, so I think one of the revelations I had making this is someone who kind of was really sympathetic to the Buddy Bradley Phil way of looking at things, is that I always assumed that what that was about was me having, I just have golden ears and I can tell that this vinyl is more realistic. But after doing that research, I'm not so sure that's the case. I think it might be the opposite. I think people like me or Buddy or Phil or whatever, we hear something ideal in vinyl. Maybe it sounds better than the way life does. I mean, Bob Woods, the Telarc guy, used to say, look, if you stand in front of a real violin, it's got some grit to it. I mean, it really is kind of harsh. And so you're not going to get that harshness as much with analog recording if you record a violin with analog methods. So again, if it sounds nicer to you, so be it. But it doesn't sound more realistic. And so that was actually one of the bigger personal revelations I had in making this, that maybe I was wrong all along in thinking that analog was more realistic. It might just be better.
I mean, did you go into this book project? I don't know how long the project itself took, what the seed of it was. You can tell me that. But did you go into it feeling fairly buddy/Phil hardcore about it, or were you already in more of a middle position than, we think of the caricatures, vinyl or death, the truth is in the groove sort of thing?
I would like to think that I was more self-aware than that, but I think I was largely in the Phil buddy camp, just because, that was the kind of ethic of a lot of the music that I grew up with and that became, really special to me. A lot of, post-punk or American indie rock or whatever kind of has that vibe that the CD is a joke. It's, a joke that corporate America has played on us or whatever. So I really did have that. I wasn't all that vocal about it, but I really did have that sense that there was something wrong with CDs. Just because there's always been something I don't like about the sound of CDs. And don't get me wrong, compact discs are great. iPods are great. All these ways of listening to music digitally are fantastic in terms of convenience, and I do them just as much as anyone else. But I went into the project thinking that there was something missing today.
And now it's fascinating that you say that, because there's so much optimism and so much pessimism both about the future of recorded sound, and I'm sure you encountered every single stripe of it researching this book. But I can't help but, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I can't help think to myself that before, there were so many bitter battles over 33 versus 45 versus vinyl versus CD, about acoustic versus electric recording, because it seemed like ultimately these formats, these types of music, these ways that an audience would hear music were just dictated from on high. It was a battle for what music would be. But now it seems increasingly you can get whatever you want. You can put out music on vinyl. You can put it out on MP3, on CD. Cheap Trick put out an 8-track recently, a very high profile. It seems like that this might be maybe a cure to a lot of the fractiousness.
I think so, and also you add to that the fact that because of things like Pro Tools, digital audio workstations is the general name for things like that. Many, many more people can make recordings than it used to be, because you don't have to have a lot of money to go into a recording studio anymore. Now, all joking aside about how maybe that's a bad thing, because there are certain people who shouldn't be making records, I think ultimately that is a good thing. And so, and a lot of recording engineers will tell you the same thing. As much as they lament the past, they also love the flexibility and the convenience and just the sense of creativity that's available with today's digital tools. So I think it's possible to kind of have it both ways. In a way, you can feel like, okay, we've maybe gotten rid of some things, but we've also taken on others that are good. And me personally, it depends on what mood I'm in on any given day, how much I feel that way. So.
Since I've brought it up, I do have to ask your opinion as an expert. What did you think of the Cheap Trick release of the new 8-track album?
It's funny. I actually haven't. I like the idea. I haven't heard it, but I thought it was a funny idea. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to hear it, but I thought that was a great idea.
Now, we can talk about the advantages in the modern world of vinyl, the advantages of MP3, the advantages of AAC, the advantages of CD. Do 8-tracks have an advantage in 2009?
Not that if there are some, it's nothing that I know about. That's why I'm curious. I don't exactly understand the impetus behind what they did, but no. As far as I know, there are not. Recording engineers are welcome to correct me, people who know more about the technical side than I do, but it doesn't seem to me that there are any.
If it was a quadraphonic 8-track, then I'd be in.
Right.
I myself grew up with CDs. That was what was around when I was a kid coming of age listening to music, and it was really the only option. Vinyl was kind of regarded by at least my very young age group as an odd anachronism. I've come to embrace it now, but then it was different. Although I couldn't help but notice in the 1990s, early and especially late 90s, that something was wrong with the music I was hearing on the radio, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And I think, as we've said, the loudness war may be the issue. Now, what for the listener was going on technologically with this loudness battle?
First, very briefly, we should define what loudness is, and this might sound sort of confusing, but a loud record is one that is manufactured so that you don't have to turn up your volume control much to get it at the level that you like. So the less you have to turn it up, the louder that record has been made. Now, what we talk about when we talk about the loudness war is beginning roughly maybe in the mid-'80s, I suppose. With each passing year, the average loudness of commercial CDs has increased more and more. It peaked probably around 1999, 2000. I think it's gone down a little bit. But the way that you make a record sound louder, and again, this is very, very simple terms, but you essentially take the softer components of the music and you boost them so that they're closer to the louder components of the music. You decrease the dynamic range. Now, and that makes for a louder sounding record, but it also, it takes stuff away. It takes away the dynamic range, which is one of the things that makes music pleasurable. And I think a lot of people don't have just sort of accepted that. A lot of people like you have sort of decided like there's just something about this stuff played on the radio. And keep in mind, it's interesting you brought up the radio because not only were records being made to sound loud, but radio was increasingly processed so that the signal sounded loud. So you had this kind of like this double whammy of loudness. And by the way, you can really, really see the effects of the loudness war. Just take a compact disc that was manufactured even, let's say, 15 years ago, play it next to one that you bought last week or a year ago or even 5 years ago, and you'll be amazed at how much more you have to turn up the volume for the older CD. Anyone who's had that experience of having putting a bunch of CDs in their CD carousel and having to keep getting up to like change the volume has probably noticed that.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Check out our website and complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Greg Milner, author of Perfecting Sound Forever, an oral history of recorded music. I just remember thinking back to the year 1999 that I would hear on the radio these songs that you make much of. The Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication, a song like Get on Top, or I'd hear Three Doors Down, Kryptonite. I'd hear these constantly, and I would say as a teenager, then I would say, well, that sounds like it sucks. But really, it seems like I couldn't tell whether it sucked or not because the sound of it sucked too much. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Plus, I mean, the handicap is also that all music by that time just about all pop music was sounding like that. So you really have nothing to compare it to. But absolutely, the Californication is the one that people who are really, kind of the anti-loudness war advocates, the activists, as it were, that's the one that's often pointed to as being the really egregious example because it is so loud that you don't even have to be someone who is even that much into music to think like, whoa, what is that? It sounds distorted. Something's not right here.
And you quote, well, you don't quote, but you show a waveform of that Black Eyed Peas song, Let's Get It Started, which is, it sounds as sound-wise bad in the same way that Get on Top did 10 years ago. So what I ask is this: why hasn't the unappealing nature of such a narrow dynamic range sort of self-corrected the system? Why hasn't it come back down? It's come a little down, but why not more at this point?
I think there's too much perceived economic advantage of having a loud recording. No one wants to be the first to disarm. I mean, if you look at it, like, say you have a band and you decide, okay, I'm going to, master my recording at a lower level, but you're a commercial band trying to break through and you're on a major label. If when somebody listens to your record, let's say in a bar and a jukebox, it's when someone plays your record, it's going to sound a lot softer and it's a lot less ear catching than everything else because it's the level of that jukebox has been set for the majority of those CDs there. So in a way, the perception is that then you've sacrificed your art and your career, because the thing about loud records is that unless they're egregiously distorted, if you play someone the same recording and you play them one that's mastered at a louder level than the other, they're always going to think that the louder one sounds better because it catches your ear. Now, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that you can't listen to loud records for as long as you can records that aren't so loud because you literally get fatigued. Your ears get worn out and you don't want to listen anymore. But there's that perception that I'm not going to be the one who's going to sacrifice my career, for this abstract notion of art, which is why, it's much more common to see more independent bands, mastering their stuff at a lower level.
Now, tell me if this analogy is too strained, but it reminds me of that Pepsi challenge that Pepsi did where they would give out little small amounts of Coke and Pepsi and do a double-blind taste test and see what people preferred. In small doses, people preferred Pepsi, but with the 2-liter bottles, they tended to prefer Coke, is that kind of like this? Like they prefer, when it's a little clip, people like to have the blast of sound. But if you're listening to a 65-minute album, you won't be able to listen to that all the way through without kind of dropping out, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's something. The funny thing about this whole idea of loudness fatigue is that I heard about it so much that I started to wonder why I'd never seen anyone show any kind of objective proof about this. And then it turns out I don't think there is. If there is some proof, some sort of test, I was not able to find them, and I don't think they exist. So it remains anecdotal, but it is kind of analogous to what you said. It's this idea that maybe something tastes good if you just take a little bit right then, it does something to your taste buds. But yeah, if you're going to, over time, it sort of starts to wear off, and maybe it's not good for the long haul.
Well, I'm imagining just listening to one of my favorite Steely Dan albums, and you bring them up as an example of the West Coast dry recording sound, and one of my favorite bands in that style as well. And I imagine listening to that album cranked up to the volume of a Black Eyed Peas single, and it's just sort of, I can't even think about it.
Yeah, that would sound really bad, probably. But yeah, it's funny you bring up Steely Dan, because Steely Dan, I think, is an example of the perfect example of that era's really dry recorded sound. And it was a sound that, about 10 years later, a younger generation of engineers would rebel against, because they thought that sounded so boring and dull. And that's why in the 80s you have these humongous, big, booming drum sounds, for example. But to me, it's funny. I still love the way those Steely Dan records sound. If I ever have to test a new piece of equipment, I like to play Gaucho, which is not that good a record, but it's recorded so well that it's a perfect way to test out a piece of hi-fi equipment.
I kind of do the same, although I haven't used Gaucho much, but now I have to ask, you don't like Gaucho? This is getting off topic, but it's not your favorite of theirs?
Well, it's not my favorite. It's funny you should mention that, because tomorrow I'm actually going to go see Steely Dan, because they're doing a series of shows here where they play a record all the way through, and we're going to see Gaucho, me and a bunch of friends, because that was the one we could get tickets to. And I don't dislike it that much. I think it's a little bit weaker than the others, although I am kind of looking forward to seeing it done live, because it's such a sort of mellow record that I think it's going to sound really nice in the Beacon Theater.
That's definitely true. But I think Babylon Sisters live, that'd be a lot of fun.
Hey, I was thinking the same thing. It's funny you say that, yeah.
Like a Sunday in TJ, that it's cheap, but it's not free. That I'm not what I used to be, and that love's not a game for three. Babylon Sisters, shake it. Babylon Sisters, shake it.
As we get into the 80s, and Gaucho kind of marks the start of the 80s, so that's convenient. We get into the 80s, you use Def Leppard as an example of a specific aesthetic or recording sensibility. What do you call it?
I call it, I mean, the way I talk about Def Leppard's hysteria is I kind of refer to it as the apotheosis of the analog era, because it was a perfect example of how complicated the process of making music had become up to that point. I mean, Hysteria took months and months, actually it took years to make, but it's so much of that time was spent with the producer Mutt Lange obsessively mixing the record and building it from the ground up. The recording of the record was almost beside the point. They recorded most of it in like a jingle studio in Dublin. It's like just a nondescript studio, because Mutt Lange didn't care. As long as he got a decently clean signal, he could work with it. And they would go to such extremes as sometimes, rather than play chords, they would record individual notes and then assemble them into chords. I mean, it was a sort of a harbinger of the kind of the way that music is made in the digital era, where you can just tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak.
The fascinating thing is reading your account of that recording process of them putting together Hysteria. You'd talk about the recording the individual parts, the individual instruments, the voice, and so on and so forth, separate from one another, assembling them together in an electronic technological interface later. And I was thinking to myself, well, yeah, that's kind of, it's the norm now. But then I realized, he's talking about the mid-1980s. Yeah. How much of the norm is that actually at this point? It seems like almost universal when I think about it, but you would know more.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think today, if you want to look at especially like really, mainstream commercial recordings, it's virtually the only way music is made. And again, I know people are going to object to that, but the vast majority of recordings are made that way. And that actually goes way back. I mean, even before that, much earlier than Hysteria. Hysteria just seemed to me to be a perfect example of how, in the analog era, when it still took a fair amount of, well, not a fair, but it took a lot of money and time to do that, how you could, if you were someone who had a lot of both of those things, you could take it to like an absurd extreme. Because, I mean, the technology got at that point in terms of recording consoles, processors, what have you, had gotten to the point where there were so many choices that if you had the time and the money to screw around with them and investigate those choices, the sky was the limit. And of course, today the sky is the limit, but it's a lot easier to do all that stuff.
As far as commercial music is concerned, then, would you imagine there would be more of a pendulum swing away from this sort of pointillism piecing it together in the studio method, or more of a dispersal in that there might become many different ways to make a commercial recording, just as there are many different ways to make a DIY recording now?
I don't think we're going back anytime soon. I mean, every once in a while there'll be, a recording that is a huge smash, and part of its apparent appeal seems to be that it is quote unquote simple. I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on her name. She had a huge record like 5 years ago, that Don't Know Why.
Norah Jones.
Norah Jones, yeah. Norah Jones is a perfect example. But where I think every so often there's a huge smash that part of its appeal, you can never prove this, but part of its appeal seems to be its simplicity. But I don't think we're going back anytime soon, because it's just, I mean, as a writer, if someone told me like, oh, your first drafts are the best and you shouldn't go back and change it, I'd be kind of like, well, no, I don't want to do. Why would I want to do that? And I don't think it's any different for musicians. I mean, the allure of being able to get something exactly right, no matter what the art form, I just think is too strong. And so today I think you have to have a lot of discipline when you make a record, because you have to make sure you don't overthink. But I don't see music in general going backwards. It's just it's too easy and too fun and too inexpensive to make records this way.
That is true. Now, reading the book, I found that what was often jumping out at me was the ways in which music recording is different from other technologies. I've read a lot of technological histories and a lot of industry histories as well. And I was thinking to myself, there's a lot of conditions that obtain and have obtained in the sound recording industry and the technology that would not, I think, in other areas. For example, I think of the two main audio conveyances of my lifetime, at least until the sound file era. Number one being the CD, and then number two, which my generation discovered later, the vinyl album. And I think, why would a technology that is 60 years old in the case of the vinyl album, and the CD, which would be, what is it at this point, 27 years old?
Yeah,
how can a technology how can they have primacy for so long?
I think that in general we're used to a narrative of technological progress that says that things can always get better. That things can always get bigger or faster or stronger or what have you. And I think in the audio world, it's not necessarily that way. I mean, a lot of recording engineers will tell you that the pure art of recording, in the traditional sense of just capturing a sound as good as possible, it peaked in the 50s and hasn't gotten any better since. And that just goes against so much of the economic rationale for technological progress, right? I mean, you don't want things to stay the same. You want things to always improve. And in the audio world, that's just not really the way things work. Or I mean, some people would say it is the way things work, but it's not necessarily the way things work. And I think more people are now discovering that fact, whether or not they're thinking consciously of it.
Well, let's take two recent examples, because many people think, and I often think as well, why haven't we gotten something that is even better sounding than the CD after this long? I mean, if I used a computer that came out in 1982, I could do nothing on it, but yet CDs seem to be, I hate to use the word perfect, but very good at what they do. What about examples like audio-only DVDs and super audio CDs that have sunk? What happened?
Well, it's the oldest story in recording, going all the way back to Edison, that people do not necessarily want the best sounding thing. I mean, SACDs sound, for example, sound fantastic, but there aren't many people out there who are going to want to bother to actually figure out if they need to, what they need to play them on, and that sort of thing. It just is not a priority for most people, especially in this day and age when the emphasis is so much on portability. I mean, the more people get used to MP3s, the less they're really going to probably care about perfect sound in the traditional sense, because MP3s, when a piece of music is encoded as an MP3 or AAC, any of those kind of lossy formats, literally between 80 and 90% of the musical information is just discarded. You're hearing a fraction of what was there in the first place, because supposedly you don't miss it, and that's debatable, of course. But that's the thing. People do not necessarily want the best thing, and CDs are very, like you said, they're very good at what they do. They're for most people, they're good enough. Although you talk to the people who actually designed the technology, and going back, and they said that at the time they always kind of assumed it was an intermediate technology and that it would be changed pretty soon, and that's of course not what happened.
It happens even more often with, to be honest, vinyl albums. I play them all the time, more than anything else. And I think to myself very often, I think just last night I think this technology came out in 1948. It shouldn't sound like this. You know the feeling?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, you mean it sound like this, and it shouldn't sound so good? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like why does it sound like it? I feel like something that from 1948 should look like television, or should sound like television looked from 1948, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to consider it. I know exactly the feeling you're talking about. I get that all the time. It just goes against everything we've been taught, not only about the way technology works, but even about the way that music works. I mean, who would ever, when we were kids, and I'm probably slightly older than you, but I think we're about the same age, who would ever think that stuff we were listening to then would sound as good today as it did then? But that's the way music is, a sort of anomaly. Recorded music is an anomaly. It doesn't work the way a lot of other technologies work.
Now, when you get to the end of the book, there's a bit of exploration going on into the future of, what might be in store for recorded sound and the experience of listening to it. And you talk about some kind of wild-sounding technologies. How close on the horizon do you see any of these things becoming consumer products? Or do you see any kind of new consumer product for listening to music or audio or anything recorded?
I mean, I think the trend is probably going to be just making stuff even smaller and more compressed so that you can fit even more onto your iPod. That's what I'm guessing. But I know what you're talking about. I think you're talking about this technology that's waveform synthesis.
Oh, yes.
Which, now, without going into the technological specifics of waveform synthesis, what makes it interesting is that it was developed by Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, who was... If there's a godfather of the MP3, it's him. I mean, the MP3 is a product of a lot of different people, but Karl-Heinz Brandenburg really did, I think, the most important work on it. And now he's doing something called waveform synthesis, which, without going into too much detail, tries to reproduce the original waveform of a recording exactly the way it was in the first place. In other words, the oldest epoch of recording that is. And it does this by essentially breaking up the wave into many, 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 many tiny pieces and rebuilding it. And again, that's a real broad stroke way of looking at it. But he really thinks that the pendulum is going to swing back, that someday people are going to have, for example, I think the term he used was sound emanating wallpaper. It'd be like, a whole wall of your house that was, lots of teeny tiny speakers that music was coming out of. And look, I heard waveform synthesis. I heard some demos of it, and it does sound fantastic, but and look, he's the visionary, not me, right? But I don't see that happening. It just seems like it would be such a huge change in what people really care about with recordings. I mean, they might agree that it sounds fantastic, but how fantastic does it have to sound? I mean, I'd rather take it with me when I, go to the gym or whatever.
The practicality of sound wallpaper seems on the face of it somewhat limited as well.
Yeah, although I have to stress, it sounds fantastic. If anyone can, go to the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, which has a waveform synthesis sound system in their theater there. It's one of the most, probably, audio, in terms of audio, one of the most sophisticated theaters probably in the world. And if you can, just get someone to give you a demo of it. It really does sound fantastic.
You mentioned quite a while ago the perception you had of your own golden ears years back, or however long. And in the same chapter where you take a listen to waveform synthesis, I believe you undergo a test where you have to choose which is the proper compression algorithm for a number of samples of audio, and you found there, if I'm not mistaken, that it's a little harder to tell whether you have golden ears or not when you get right down to it.
Yeah, that was a real shock. I mean, me with my buddy Phil attitude, I went up to I went to Ottawa, where there's something called the Communications Research Centre Canada. Now, they do it's a government agency, and they do a lot of different research, but one of the things they're known for is they're one of a handful of places in the world that does really, really, really sophisticated subjective listening tests on new codecs, like AAC, for example, went through extensive testing there. They don't develop them, but they put them through these tests. And without going into too much detail of how these tests work, you're basically played a piece of music or sometimes a clip from a movie that's encoded like a CD, with the exact same technology. And then you have two other choices that are both the identical sound. One is exactly identical to what you first heard. It's a CD quality thing. And the other is some sort of compression algorithm, some sort of codec. And you're supposed to pick which one you think is the codec. And then you're supposed to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how annoying you found whatever artifacts were there that told you. And that's really the word they use, annoying. And so I thought, like, okay, how hard can this possibly be? Everyone knows that MP3s and AAC sound worse than anything else, than a CD even. So this is going to be easy. And so they gave me a very shortened version of the test, and they wouldn't tell me the results. That's one of their rules, because they found by experience that they don't want to make people who think they have golden ears discover that they really have ears of tin. So I don't know how I did. Maybe I did well, but I was shocked by how much more difficult it was to tell the difference absolutely than I thought it would be. It really changed the whole way that I thought about my perception of music. That it's just not. I went in there thinking it would be a cinch, and it was not at all.
I myself will admit that I make no claims to being able to tell randomly what is an MP3, what is a AAC, what is a CD, but it does seem to me that with something that I have listened to on CD for a very long time, only then can I actually tell if it's been compressed. Have you had the same experience yourself?
I have, except not there. That was the funny thing.
Yeah,
I mean, one of the things they played was a clip from Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. Now, I'm no huge fan of Dire Straits or that album, but someone who grew up listening to FM rock radio in the 80s, like, I heard those songs like millions of times, and that was difficult. I mean, I thought that I'd had that experience, but it turns out that if I've had those experiences in the past, maybe they weren't as reliable as I thought they were.
Now, you came through this to be able to write and publish the book, and it's an excellent book, but I do wonder how much of your identity was predicated on the whole golden ear thing before that.
Not in the sense that I've never been one of these audiophiles. I mean, my stereo setup at home is probably somewhat nicer than the average, but it's by no means, I've never had the money or, frankly, the wherewithal to be one of those obsessives. But I did pride myself, in thinking that I knew where it was at sound-wise, and I just don't, after writing this book, I'm just not so convinced anymore. I mean, honestly, for me, I've decided the big jump is from digital to analog. In other words, to me, the difference between a vinyl record and a compact disc in general is greater than the difference between a compact disc and an MP3 or a AAC. To me, the big decisive moment is the jump from digital to analog. I mean, frankly, I'm amazed at how good MP3s and AACs sound, considering how little of the music actually survives the process.
I suppose the proof is all in this, though. When you find yourself actually listening to music, which I imagine you do with some frequency, what are the formats you do use the most in life?
Well, I feel like honesty compels me to say that I haven't listened to my turntable in months because it's broken and I just haven't been able to figure out what's wrong and if I need to get it repaired. Now, I mention that because I wanted to show that there's a lot to love about digital audio. There's a lot of, it's convenient, it's simple to use. So for the last several months, I've listened to almost exclusively CDs and not even really my iPod much because I don't know. For me, I go through phases of the iPod where I get kind of sick of it. So it's been mostly compact discs for me, and I hope one of these stays soon. I've got to repair my turntable so I can listen to vinyl again. But I'm not going to lie. Even someone like me, like CDs, there's an allure to them. You just throw them in, and that's that.
Now, given your position at kind of the center of, I suppose, some subset of this, do you find that the Buddies and the Phils of the world, or maybe the guys that you knew in high school or college, and the funny thing you mentioned in this book is they are always guys.
It's true, they are.
Do you find that the Buddies and the Phils are giving up or reducing in number, or is there a garrison mentality forming among them?
It's an interesting question because on the one end, I feel like there is a little bit more awareness of that attitude growing. So you are recruiting some younger people, but in general, I feel it's like an age thing. I mean, I'm just old enough where I had a good memory of what it was like to listen to music in the pre-CD era. So that's my baseline. So I have that. It's almost like muscle memory. I have that idea in my head of what music can and should sound like. If you're someone who just grew up listening to CDs or cassette tapes for that matter, you don't have that baseline. And so that Buddy Phil mentality is going to seem much more foreign and weird. So I guess what I'm saying is, I mean, we're not that old yet, but it's going to be kind of like, World War I veterans. Like eventually we're just going to start like dying out. There's going to be less and less of us.
I think there are 3 maybe World War I guys left.
Something like that. I think there's 3, yeah.
The title of the book, once again, is Perfecting Sound Forever and Aural History of Recorded Music. Greg Milner, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks again for having me.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our music, as always, is produced by Ben Althouse. His website is available at benalthouse.com. And for our complete interview archive, other fun stuff and more, check out colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.